There is a place on the map of Antarctica that carries one of the most famous surnames in the history of money. It sits in the western half of the continent, a vast tilted shelf of ice rising toward the interior, and on every official chart it is printed in plain lettering as the Rockefeller Plateau. Not far from it stand the Rockefeller Mountains, and just beyond those, the Edsel Ford Ranges, and past those again, a line of buried volcanoes called the Executive Committee Range. 4 names, all from the same short list of American fortunes, all pressed onto the emptiest land on Earth within a single decade. And around that cluster of names a story has grown up in the darker corners of the internet, a story that says the Rockefellers did not merely lend their name to that plateau, they built something on it, something that no aircraft is allowed to overfly, that no survey party is permitted to reach, that appears on no research schedule and no tourist route. A private holding at the bottom of the world, fenced off not by walls, but by silence. It is a good story. It has the shape of the truth without the weight of it. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And tonight we are going to take it apart slowly, because the pieces that fall out when you do are stranger and more useful than the legend they came wrapped in. There is no secret structure on the Rockefeller Plateau, but the reason that name is there at all, the reason a plateau of ice 2,000 miles from anything answers to an oil dynasty, is a real story about who paid to explore the last blank space on the map and what they expected in return. The plateau was never a building. It was a receipt. And once you learn to read it, you start seeing the same handwriting all over the continent. So let us begin with the obvious question that almost nobody asks. How does a family from Cleveland, Ohio, end up with its name on Antarctic bedrock? The answer runs through a man named Richard Evelyn Byrd, a naval officer and aviator who, in the late 1920s, set out to do something no one had done. He wanted to fly to the South Pole and back, and he wanted to map the unknown interior of the continent from the air, and he wanted to do it as a spectacle the whole world would watch. What he did not have was money. Polar expeditions in that era were staggeringly expensive. You needed ships strengthened against pack ice, aircraft, fuel, dogs, prefabricated buildings, tons of food, radio equipment, and wages for dozens of men who would vanish from civilization for a year or more. No government was going to hand him that. So Byrd did what the age required. He went to the men who had the money, and he sold them the one thing an explorer has to sell. He sold them immortality on the map. This is the mechanism the legend never mentions, and it is the key to everything that follows. In the 1800s and early 1900s, the naming of newly charted land had quietly become a form of currency. An explorer arrived somewhere no European chart had recorded, and the right to attach a name to a mountain or a bay or a stretch of coast belonged, by custom, to the one who got there and wrote it down. That right could be given away. It could be given to a king to flatter him, to a scientific society to court it, or increasingly, to a wealthy backer as the return on his investment. You financed the voyage, and in exchange your name went onto a feature that would appear on every map printed forever after. It was the cleanest branding deal ever invented. The customer paid once, and the advertisement lasted for geological time. Byrd understood this perfectly. When he assembled the backers for his first Antarctic expedition, which sailed at the end of 1928 and wintered on the Ross Ice Shelf at a base he called Little America, he was assembling a portfolio of American industrial fortunes. John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of the founder of Standard Oil and the steward of the largest private fortune the country had yet produced, was among the principal donors. So was Edsel Ford, son of Henry Ford and president of the Ford Motor Company. There were others, some giving cash, some giving equipment, some giving the aircraft themselves, and Byrd repaid them in the currency of his trade. When his men discovered a previously unrecorded range of mountains poking through the ice east of the base in 1929, he named it the Rockefeller Mountains. When further flights revealed a great highland of ice stretching inland that became the Rockefeller Plateau, The Edsall Ford Ranges honoured the Ford heir. Marie Byrd Land, the enormous region containing most of these features, he named for his own wife. None of this was hidden. It was, in fact, the opposite of hidden. It was publicity, and publicity was the whole point. Byrd's expeditions were media events on a scale that is hard to picture now. The New York Times bought exclusive rights to the story. Radio broadcasts came out of Little America. Newsreels ran in cinemas. The names of the donors, stamped onto newly discovered land at the bottom of the world, were part of the return they were buying. A gift to Byrd was not anonymous charity. It was an investment in prestige, and the prestige was delivered in the most permanent medium available to any human being, which is the map. So when you see the Rockefeller name on that plateau and your mind reaches for a secret, understand that the truth is louder than a secret and stranger for being loud. The name is there because it was announced in the papers, on the radio, in the newsreels, as thanks for a check, which brings us to the family itself, because you cannot understand why that name was worth putting on a plateau without understanding what the name had come to mean. John D. Rockefeller, the elder, had built Standard Oil in the 1870s and 1880s into something the world had never seen. It was not simply a large company. It was a machine for controlling an entire industry from the inside. Rockefeller did not usually crush his competitors in open combat. He absorbed them. He negotiated secret rebates from the railroads that carried oil, so that his freight cost less than everyone else's, which meant he could undersell them until they either sold to him or went under. He bought the pipelines, the refineries, the barrel factories, the tank cars. By the time the public understood what had happened, one organization refined and moved the overwhelming majority of the oil in the United States, and the man at the center of it had become the richest person in the country and, before long, the first billionaire in the history of the world. Now hold that picture next to the plateau, because the two things are made of the same material. Standard Oil's genius was never really about oil. It was about control of a flow, control the movement of a resource, control the ledger on which its price is written, and you do not need to own every barrel. You only need to own the choke point through which every barrel must pass. That is a pattern we are going to see again when we get to the ice, because a continent, it turns out, can also be a choke point, and the men who learned to think in flows were exactly the men whose names ended up on it. Standard Oil grew so dominant that in 1911 the Supreme Court of the United States ordered it broken apart under the antitrust laws, split into more than 30 separate companies. This is often told as the humbling of Rockefeller, and in the newspapers it looked like one. But watch what actually happened to the money. Rockefeller held shares in the parent company, and when it shattered into fragments, he held shares in every fragment. Those fragments included the companies that would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and the American arm of what is now part of BP. In the years after the breakup, the combined value of the pieces rose higher than the whole had been. The court had taken the empire apart and, in doing so, had multiplied the founder's fortune. The lesson was not lost on anyone paying attention. You could dismantle the structure and leave the ownership completely intact. Remember that sentence. We will need it at the bottom of the world. By the 1920s, the Rockefeller name carried a second meaning layered over the first, and this is the meaning that actually put it on the plateau. The family had become the most powerful force in American philanthropy. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, along with the General Education Board and a cluster of related bodies, was pouring the oil fortune into medicine, science, public health, and universities on a scale that no government department could match. This was not simple generosity, and the family did not pretend it was. Philanthropy on that scale was a way of shaping the world according to your judgment of what the world should be. When you fund the medical schools, you help decide what counts as medicine. When you fund the researchers, you help decide which questions get asked. When you fund the survey, you help decide what gets mapped and what gets left blank. There was also, underneath the generosity, a wound the family was trying to dress. In 1914, at a coal operation in Colorado controlled by Rockefeller interests, a long and bitter strike ended in the deaths of miners and members of their families during a confrontation with the state militia and company guards, an event remembered as the Ludlow Massacre. The name that would soon sit serenely on an Antarctic plateau was, in that moment, one of the most hated names in American labor. And the family's response was, in its way, as significant as the fortune itself. They hired one of the first modern public relations men, a former journalist who understood that reputation could be manufactured as deliberately as kerosene. Over the following years, the public image of the dynasty was rebuilt, softened, turned philanthropic and grandfatherly, until the association with dead miners faded and the association with hospitals and universities took its place. By the time Byrd went looking for backers in the late 20s, the Rockefeller name was something a man could be proud to have stamped on a mountain. That transformation was not an accident. It was a campaign, and it had been paid for. And here is the piece that ties the philanthropy directly to the ice, rather than leaving it as background. The great American fortunes of that era did not confine their giving to hospitals and schools. They funded the sciences of the earth itself, the observatories and the laboratories, and above all the expeditions, because exploration was among the most prestigious forms of philanthropy a rich man could buy. To put your money behind a voyage into the unknown was to attach your name to discovery, to courage, to the expansion of human knowledge, and to do it in a way that generated headlines rather than quiet gratitude. Museums sent collectors to the far corners of the world on the money of industrialists and named the halls after them. Geographic societies mounted expeditions underwritten by industrial wealth and read the donors' names into the record of every find. The same class of fortune that was rebuilding its reputation through medicine and education was, at the very same time, financing the men who sailed and flew into the blank spaces and came back holding the right to name whatever they had found. Backing an explorer was philanthropy and advertising fused into a single act, and it paid a return no hospital wing could match, because a hospital wing sits on one street in one city, while a name given to a mountain or a plateau enters the permanent geography of the entire planet. When John D. Rockefeller Jr. wrote his check to Byrd, he was not doing something strange for a man of his position. He was doing the most characteristic thing such a man could do, converting a fortune built on a flow of oil into a name carved across the last unmapped country on Earth. So when the name went onto the ice, it went as the finished product of all of that. The oil, the flow, the breakup that multiplied the money, the foundations that shaped what counted as knowledge, and the careful reconstruction of a reputation. The plateau did not receive a secret, it received a brand at the height of its polish, and the men who administered that brand understood better than anyone alive that the most durable form of ownership is not a fence around a thing, it is your name on the record of the thing, which is exactly what a plateau on a map is, a record. It is worth pausing on how a name like that becomes permanent, because the process is more revealing than you would expect. A name attached to newly charted land does not stay real just because one explorer wrote it in a logbook. It has to be adopted into an official register, reviewed and approved and printed, and from that point forward it becomes the standard label that every chart, every atlas, every scientific paper is expected to use. The United States maintains a standing board whose job is to rule on the names of Antarctic features, deciding which proposed names are accepted onto American maps and which are set aside. Byrd's donor names went into that permanent record and stayed there. This is the machinery that turns a thank you into a fact. Once the board has spoken, the Rockefeller Plateau is not a nickname or a courtesy. It is the plateau's name, as official and durable as the name of any city, and it will outlast every person who ever argued about how it got there. And the pattern goes deeper than the plateau alone, into that line of buried volcanoes I mentioned at the start, the Executive Committee range. Look closely at what that name is actually telling you. It is named, in plain language, for the Executive Committee of Byrd's expedition, the board of men who organized and financed and managed the whole enterprise. The individual volcanoes within the range carry the individual surnames of individual members of that committee. A board of directors, in other words, was converted directly into a mountain range, each financier given his own peak. There is no metaphor being stretched here. The men who put up the money for the expedition are, to this day, the official names of a chain of volcanoes in the interior of Antarctica. If you wanted a single image for the thesis of this entire story, that a continent was turned into a ledger, and the ledger was written in the names of the people who paid, You could hardly invent one better than a range of fire mountains under the ice, each one bearing the name of a man on the funding committee. Byrd's second expedition, which went south in the early 1930s, made the commercial logic of all this even plainer. It was an enterprise wrapped in sponsorships and product tie-ins, and a regular radio program broadcast to audiences back home, a venture that sold its story before the ships had even sailed. And it produced the most famous episode of Byrd's life, the one that shows how completely exploration and content had fused into a single thing. Byrd chose to spend a winter alone at a small weather station set inland from the coast, by himself in the dark and the cold for months, and while he was there the stove and generator that kept him alive began leaking carbon monoxide, and he very nearly died of the poisoning, saved only when his men grew alarmed at his garbled radio messages and struggled out to reach him. It was a genuine brush with death, a real ordeal of the kind that kills men in that country every so often, and Byrd turned it into a best-selling book. Even the near loss of his own life became a product, printed and bound and sold. That is not a criticism of the man, who was brave and very nearly paid the ultimate price for it. It is simply the truth of what these expeditions were. They were science, and they were sponsorship at the same time, discovery and merchandise in the same breath, and the names left on the map were the most permanent piece of merchandise of all. Now let us turn to the part of the legend that insists something was physically built out there, because it deserves a fair and complete answer rather than a wave of the hand. Did Byrd's expeditions construct anything on or near the Rockefeller Plateau? They did. They built a base, and then more bases, all called Little America, on the Ross Ice Shelf, well to the west of the plateau proper. These were real settlements, clusters of prefabricated huts that were steadily buried by drifting and accumulating snow until the men were living in a warren of tunnels beneath the surface, connected by passages, lit by electric light, warmed by stoves, stocked with a year of food. To a person who has only seen the frozen exterior, the idea of a buried, lamp-lit town under the Antarctic snow sounds like the very heart of the conspiracy. But there is nothing hidden about Little America. It is one of the most documented human undertakings of its century. Its construction was filmed. Its daily life was broadcast. Its layout was printed in books that sold in the hundreds of thousands. And here is the detail that quietly demolishes the secret structure legend. Those bases did not last, and they were never meant to. The Ross Ice Shelf is not solid ground. It is a floating sheet of ice, hundreds of feet thick, that is constantly moving seaward, and at its edge it breaks off into icebergs. Every one of the Little America bases was eventually carried toward the ocean edge by the flow of the shelf, buried deeper each year, and finally either crushed, entombed beyond recovery, or carved off entirely into the sea as part of an iceberg. There is a genuine possibility that the remains of one of the early Little Americas is at this moment frozen inside an iceberg somewhere in the Southern Ocean, or already melted out and gone. Whatever the Rockefeller money helped build in Antarctica was temporary by the plain physics of the place. You cannot maintain a permanent secret installation on a conveyor belt of ice that is trying to slide into the sea and shatter. The continent itself will not allow it. And if you still suspect a hidden installation somewhere out in that region, consider what became of the one real station the United States actually did build in the interior of Marie Byrd Land, because its fate is the cleanest possible answer to the fantasy. For the great international scientific effort of the late 1950s, when the nations of the world coordinated a burst of research across Antarctica, the Americans established an inland base and named it, appropriately enough, Byrd Station. This was no legend. It was a genuine interior outpost, staffed for years, doing serious geophysics, and it was from that station that scientists drilled one of the first holes all the way down through the ice sheet to the bedrock beneath, a real and difficult and well-documented achievement. And what happened to Byrd Station is exactly what happened to Little America and to everything else built on that ice. The snow buried it. Season after season the accumulation piled on and pressed down. The tunnels and buildings deformed under the growing weight above them. The roofs began to sag and crack, and in time the station had to be abandoned and left to be swallowed. There is, right now, a buried and crushed American station out in Marie Byrd Land. Its position is published. The papers written from its data sit in libraries. It was surrendered to the ice, not because of any secret, but because the ice, given enough time, defeats everything placed on it. And here is the point that should end the argument. If the government of the most powerful nation on Earth, with a public budget and a fleet of aircraft and a small army of engineers, could not keep a documented, funded, fully staffed station from being crushed and buried and abandoned out there, then the idea that some private party has maintained a hidden installation on that same ice, in secret, for decades, is not a mystery. It is a physical impossibility wearing the costume of one. But the legend has a deeper root than Little America, and honesty requires that we dig it out too. Much of the modern belief in a hidden Antarctic presence traces back to a naval operation and to a document that does not exist. The operation was real. In the winter of 1946 and 47, the United States Navy sent a large fleet and several thousand men to Antarctica in an exercise called Operation High Jump under Byrd's nominal command. Because it was large and military and happened just after a world war, it has been retold for decades as a secret battle against a hidden base, a war fought in the ice against an enemy that the public was never told about. The mundane truth is that high jump was a training and logistics exercise. The Navy wanted to learn how to operate in extreme cold, to test equipment and men against polar conditions, with an eye toward a possible future conflict in the northern hemisphere rather than the southern, and to photograph and map as much coastline as possible while it was down there. It was cut short, not by a mysterious enemy, but by the ordinary brutality of the Antarctic autumn closing in, by aircraft losses in bad water, and by the simple exhaustion of a plan that had bitten off more than one season could chew. The scale of it is what feeds the myth. Thousands of men and dozens of ships and aircraft is a large number for a scientific errand, and largeness invites suspicion, as though so much effort could only be the cover for some grander and darker purpose. But large polar operations are large for boring reasons. The distances are enormous, the margin for error is thin, and everything from fuel to food to spare engine parts has to be carried in from the other side of the planet, so even a straightforward mapping and cold weather training mission needs a small navy to keep it alive. There is no record of combat in it, no casualties inflicted by any enemy, no territory taken or lost, only the ordinary toll that savage weather always exacts from anyone foolish enough to challenge it. What the operation actually produced was a mountain of aerial photographs. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Thousands upon thousands of them, images of coastline taken to fill in the map, which is precisely the dull and valuable thing the Navy had said it was going down there to do. The document that does not exist is the so-called secret diary attributed to Byrd, a text that circulates online describing a flight beyond the pole into a hidden warm land inside the Earth, complete with encounters with a hidden civilization. There is no credible evidence that Byrd ever wrote such a thing. It surfaced long after his death. It matches the style of a genre of hollow earth fiction that was popular for a century before him, and it contradicts everything in his actual published and archived records, which are extensive and mundane in the way that real expedition logs always are, full of fuel calculations and wind readings and the tedium of keeping men alive. The hollow earth idea itself is far older than Byrd, going back to speculative writers of the 18th and 19th centuries, and it attached itself to him precisely because he was the most famous polar flyer alive. Fame is a magnet for invented stories. The bigger the real achievement, the larger the myth that can hang from it. There is one more strand, and it comes from the other side of the war. During the 1930s, a German expedition surveyed a portion of the Antarctic coast and dropped markers claiming a zone they called New Swabia in the region facing the Atlantic. From that real but modest event grew an entire mythology of a secret wartime base, a hidden fortress in the ice, survivors of a defeated regime holed up at the bottom of the world with advanced machines. None of it has ever been substantiated. The New Swabia survey was a brief aerial reconnaissance, tied to interests in whaling and in beating rival nations to a territorial claim, and the region it covered is on the far side of the continent from the Rockefeller Plateau in any case. But you can see how these strands braid together in the popular imagination, a real base that vanished into the ice, a real naval operation dressed up as a secret war, a forged diary about a hidden world, a real foreign survey inflated into a fortress. Lay them side by side, and a person predisposed to see a pattern will see one. The pattern is not in the ice, it is in us. We are creatures who evolved on the surface of the world, and a place that is genuinely blank on our maps feels, to something old in the brain, like a place that must be hiding something. The discomfort is real. The cause we assign to it usually is not. So let us confront the other half of the claim directly. Is it true that no survey goes to the Rockefeller Plateau? Is that region really the unwatched, unmapped blank the legend needs it to be? Here the answer is genuinely interesting, because the legend has hold of a real fact and has turned it exactly upside down. It is true that almost no human being sets foot on the Rockefeller Plateau or on most of the deep interior of Marie Byrd Land. It is one of the most remote, least visited, most physically punishing places on the entire planet. It is thousands of feet above sea level, buried under ice that is itself thousands of feet thick, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast, savagely cold, and useful to almost no one for setting up a camp. If your test of whether a place is surveyed is whether people walk around on it, then yes, this is about as unsurveyed as land gets. But that is not how the interior of Antarctica is surveyed at all, and it has not been for generations. The plateau is watched constantly, from above, in ways that a ground party never could match. Aircraft fly systematic grids over the interior, trailing ice-penetrating radar that reads the shape of the bedrock through miles of ice, mapping mountains and valleys and lakes that no eye will ever see directly. Satellites measure the exact elevation of the ice surface to within centimeters and measure tiny variations in gravity that reveal the mass of rock hidden beneath, and measure the ice as it flows and thins and thickens. Great international projects have stitched all of this together into detailed maps of the land beneath the ice across the whole continent, the Rockefeller Plateau included. We know, from these surveys, that Marie Byrd Land hides a field of volcanoes under its ice, some of them still capable of heat, one of them, Mount Sidley, rising high enough to break the surface. We know the shape of the rock under the plateau better than we knew the shape of most of the visible Earth a century ago. The idea that no survey goes there is true only in the narrowest and most misleading sense. No survey walks there. Every survey that matters flies over it, or looks down on it from orbit, and has done so for decades. And this is the quiet joke buried inside the legend. People imagine a secret because they picture the plateau as unwatched. In reality, it is one of the most thoroughly instrumented pieces of ground on the planet. The blankness is on the tourist map and in the popular imagination, not in the scientific record. The land is not hidden. It is simply not visited, because there is, so far, nothing there worth the appalling cost of a visit. To grasp just how little anyone goes to that particular plateau, look at where the human beings in Antarctica actually are, because they are not spread evenly across the continent. They are clustered in two kinds of place, and neither of them is the deep interior of Marie Byrd Land. The first cluster is on the coast. The largest human settlement on the continent is a research town on the shore of the Ross Sea that swells to well over 1,000 people in the southern summer, and it sits where it sits for one plain reason, which is that ships can reach it. Everything a station needs, fuel and food and machinery and people, has to be hauled in, and hauling it by sea to the edge of the ice is vastly cheaper than dragging it hundreds of miles up onto a frozen highland. So the stations ring the coastline like barnacles, wherever a ship or a supply flight can get close. The second cluster is at the geographic South Pole itself, where there is a permanent station, placed there not because the pole is convenient, for it is one of the least convenient spots imaginable, but because the pole is a symbol, and symbols justify budgets. Beyond those two kinds of place, the tourists who visit Antarctica overwhelmingly go to the peninsula that reaches up towards South America, the nearest and mildest corner, and they see penguins and glaciers and go home. Almost nobody, in any given year, has any reason to be anywhere near the Rockefeller Plateau. It is not sealed off. It is simply expensive and useless, and expense and uselessness together make a more effective barrier than any fence. The emptiness out there is a line in a budget, not a line of guards, which returns us, as everything in this story eventually does, to money. Because the real question was never whether something is buried in the ice. The real question is who has arranged to own the ice, and the answer to that is the strangest part of the whole affair, and the part that actually connects back to the man whose name is on the plateau. Before we get to who owns the ice, it is worth asking why anyone cared about the far south economically in the first place, long before anyone dreamed of minerals sealed beneath a mile of ice. The answer, for well over a century, was oil. Not the oil that comes out of the ground, but the oil that came out of whales. Before petroleum lit the lamps and greased the machinery of the industrial world, whale oil did that work, and the cold seas around Antarctica held the last great concentration of whales left anywhere on the planet. Companies and nations sent fleets south, including enormous factory ships that were floating slaughterhouses, able to haul whales up a ramp and render them down into barrels of oil right there on the open water without ever making port. The islands and coastal anchorages of the far south became genuinely valuable industrial property, staging grounds for one of the most profitable and most brutal extractive industries of its age. When the claiming nations later drew their wedge-shaped slices across the map of Antarctica, they drew them, in large part, to control access to those whaling grounds and to the shipping lanes that served them. So the very first economic value anyone ever assigned to that continent was oil, rendered from the bodies of the largest animals that have ever lived, taken until the great whale populations of the Southern Ocean were pushed to the edge of collapse. And there is a bitter symmetry in what follows. The Rockefeller fortune was built on the petroleum that drove whale oil out of the market and shut the whalers down. And it was the Rockefeller name, among the others, that ended up printed across the interior of the continent whose surrounding waters those same whalers had spent a century emptying. The old oil and the new oil met at the bottom of the world, and the new oil wrote its name on the ice. Consider the odd legal status of the exact region we are discussing. Antarctica is carved up, on paper, into wedge-shaped territorial claims made by a handful of nations over the past century, slices radiating out from the pole like pieces of a pie. But there is one great slice that no country claims. It is Marie Byrd Land, the very region that contains the Rockefeller Plateau, the Rockefeller Mountains, the Edsall Ford Ranges, and the Executive Committee Range. It is the largest single piece of unclaimed land on the face of the earth. And the reason it is unclaimed is itself a piece of economic history. It was too remote and too worthless, in the eyes of the claiming powers, to be worth the diplomatic effort of formally seizing on a map. The nations drew their wedges over the parts of Antarctica that faced their shipping lanes and their whaling grounds and their strategic interests, and left the hardest, highest, emptiest quarter blank, because a claim you cannot use or defend is a liability, not an asset. So here is the picture that emerges when you set the legend aside. The one part of Antarctica that carries the Rockefeller name is also the one part that no government has bothered to claim. An American aviator, financed by American industrial fortunes, flew over it, named it after his backers, and photographed it for the newsreels, and then everyone went home, and no state ever planted a flag of ownership over it that the world agreed to honor. It is, in a strange and literal sense, a place with a brand, but no landlord. The name on the plateau is the only mark of possession that region has ever received, and that mark was not a claim of sovereignty. It was a thank you note to a donor. The Rockefellers do not own the Rockefeller Plateau. Nobody does. What they own is the naming of it, and in the long run, as the family had already learned from the breakup of Standard Oil, the naming can outlast the owning. You can lose the thing and keep your name on it forever. Now, why does any of this matter, beyond a curiosity of the map? It matters because the arrangement that governs Antarctica today, the arrangement that keeps that plateau blank and unclaimed and unexploited, is a direct descendant of the way men like the Rockefellers learned to think about resources. In 1959, the nations with an interest in Antarctica signed a treaty that did something remarkable. It froze all the territorial claims in place. It did not resolve them, and it did not cancel them. It simply set them aside, agreeing that for the duration of the treaty no claim would be pressed, no new claim would be recognized, and the continent would be reserved for peaceful and scientific use. The claims did not vanish. They were suspended, held in a kind of legal cold storage, exactly as valid and exactly as inert as the day the treaty was signed. If that maneuver sounds familiar, it should. It is the Standard Oil breakup run in reverse. In 1911, a court took a single structure and split it into pieces while leaving the underlying ownership intact. In 1959, a treaty took a set of competing ownership claims and froze them into stillness while leaving every one of them intact underneath. In both cases, the visible arrangement changed completely, and the real distribution of potential power did not change at all. The claims to Antarctica are still there, sleeping under the treaty like the fragments of Standard Oil sleeping inside a diversified portfolio, waiting for the conditions that would make them worth waking. Nobody gave anything up. They agreed, for now, not to fight over it. That is a very different thing, and the difference is the entire game. Then, in 1991, the treaty nations added a protocol that went further and banned mining and mineral extraction across the whole continent, designating Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. On its face, this is the strongest possible protection, a flat prohibition on digging anything valuable out of the ice. But read the fine print of history, and a familiar shape appears. The ban is not permanent in the way a law of nature is permanent. It is a decision that can be reviewed, and the framework contains a date, decades out, at which the parties can revisit the terms. Whether the ban holds forever or is one day reopened depends entirely on what the ice is found to be worth, and on who, at that future moment, holds the power to press the frozen claims that never actually died. The mineral wealth of Antarctica has never been proven and may be modest or may be enormous. Nobody truly knows, in part because the mining ban has removed the incentive to look hard, and so the continent sits in a strange suspended state, claims frozen but alive. Mining banned but not forever. A whole landmass held in reserve, off the ledger, its value undetermined, its ownership pending. It is not as though the continent has offered no hints of what it might hold. The earliest expeditions to reach the great mountains that divide Antarctica came back carrying coal, real seams of it exposed in the rock, along with fossils of leaves and wood, proof that this frozen waste was once a warm, forested land, joined to the other southern continents before it drifted to the pole and froze. A place that once grew forests is a place that can hold the buried remains of forests, which is to say coal, and possibly far more. There are enormous, layered formations of igneous rock in the Antarctic interior, of the kind that, on other continents, cradle valuable metals. There are deep sedimentary basins beneath the seas that fringe the continent, in the Ross embayment and the Weddell embayment, that resemble, in their broad geology, the basins that have yielded petroleum elsewhere in the southern hemisphere. None of this has been shown to be worth extracting. Under a mile of moving ice, at the bottom of the world, with the nearest port a stormy ocean away and a treaty forbidding the drill, even a genuinely rich deposit might cost more to reach than it could ever return. But that is precisely the nature of an option. The value of an unexercised option on an enormous prize does not depend on the prize being reachable today. It depends on the possibility that it might be reachable and profitable someday, under conditions that have not yet arrived. You hold the option. You keep others from exercising it. You pay almost nothing to maintain it. And you wait for the world to change in a way that turns the possibility into a payout. That is the reserve logic in its purest form, and it is the logic that governs the whole of Antarctica right now, a continent of unexercised options, held open, priced at nothing, watched from orbit, and waiting. That, in the end, is what was really built out on the Rockefeller Plateau, and it was not a structure. It was a way of holding an asset without using it, of keeping something off the market until the market is ready for it, of writing your name onto a resource long before anyone has decided what the resource is worth. The men who financed the exploration of Antarctica were the same men, or the sons of the same men, who had built fortunes on exactly this principle. Control the flow, not every barrel. Own the choke point, not every field. Keep the asset in reserve and let its scarcity do the work. Standard Oil kept the price of oil where it wanted it, not by pumping frantically, but by controlling what reached the market and when. A continent held in treaty-frozen suspension, its minerals sealed by a ban with a review date, its claims sleeping but never renounced, is the purest expression of that same instinct, scaled up to the size of the seventh continent and cooled to the temperature of the ice. And the naming, that quaint old custom of putting a donor's surname on a mountain, turns out to be not quaint at all. It was the first act of enclosure in a place that had never been enclosed. Before birds' flights, the interior of Marie Birdland had no names at all, not because it was empty of meaning, but because no outside power had yet reached it to write meaning onto it. The moment the names went on, the blank became inventory. A nameless plateau belongs to no one and to everyone. A plateau with a name on the official register has entered the ledger of the world. It can be referred to, allocated, negotiated over, remembered. The Rockefeller name on that ice was the survey stake of a new kind of frontier, driven not into soil but into the record, and it did the same work a survey stake always does. It converted open ground into described ground, and described ground is the first step toward owned ground. The family that had learned to turn the breakup of an empire into the multiplication of a fortune understood that a name on a map is a claim that costs nothing to hold and can be activated whenever the law and the market allow. This is the oldest move in the history of property, far older than Antarctica's discovery, and it has worn many costumes across the centuries. Wherever open land has been brought under ownership, the first instrument of the change has almost never been a wall or an army. It has been a survey and a name. Someone arrives, measures the ground, draws it onto a chart, attaches labels to its features, and files the result with an authority that agrees to honour it. From that moment, the land has an owner of record even when no one is standing on it, because the record is the thing that courts and governments and markets actually recognise. Physical possession is expensive and temporary. A name on an official register is cheap and close to eternal. Every frontier that was ever closed was closed this way, on paper, with instruments and ink, long before any fences went up, and the fences, when they finally came, only made visible a claim that the survey had already established years or decades earlier. What Bird did in the skies over Marie Birdland was that same ancient act performed in a new medium. He could not fence the ice and no one could farm it, but he could describe it and name it and enter it into the record, and by doing so he lifted it out of the category of the unclaimed unknown and set it into the category of the charted and the labelled, which is the first category on the long road to the owned. The plateau went onto the ledger the day it received its name, and it has sat on that ledger ever since, waiting, like every other described and undeveloped asset in the world, for the day its description finally turns into a price. So walk it back through, the whole chain, and see how little of the legend survives and how much of the truth remains. There is no secret Rockefeller structure on the Antarctic Plateau, because the only structures ever built in that part of the world were temporary huts on floating ice that the continent has long since swallowed or thrown into the sea. There is no forbidden zone that no survey may enter, because the region is watched more closely from the air and from orbit than almost anywhere else on Earth, and has been for 2 generations. There is no hidden war, no inner Earth kingdom, no fortress of a fallen regime, only a training exercise, a forged diary, and a brief foreign flight, braided together by minds that cannot tolerate a blank space. Every supernatural element of the story dissolves the moment you press it. And yet the thing that remains after all that dissolving is not nothing. It is a plateau of ice the size of a small country, named for an oil dynasty, sitting inside the largest unclaimed territory on the planet, on a continent whose ownership has been frozen by treaty and whose wealth has been sealed by a ban that carries a review date. It is a real asset, held in real reserve, marked with a real name, waiting on a real clock. The legend imagined a building and missed the arrangement, which is far more valuable than any building could ever be. The people who financed the naming of Antarctica were not hiding a structure in the ice. They were, whether they fully intended it or not, demonstrating the oldest trick in their trade. You do not need to occupy a thing to own the idea of it. You only need to be the name that history attaches to it, and then wait. There is one last turn of the screw, and it is worth naming because it is happening right now in the very act of telling this story. The legend of a secret Rockefeller base has itself become a product. It sells videos and books and channel memberships and advertising over and over, year after year. The blank space on the map is being mined a third time. It was mined first for the whale oil in the seas around it. It may be mined someday for whatever lies beneath the ice, if the ban ever lifts and the price is ever right. And it is being mined continuously at this moment for the mystery itself. The emptiness turns out to be renewable in a way no mineral could ever be, because a mystery that cannot be reached and cannot be finally disproven can be sold again and again forever, and every retelling earns once more. So there are, in truth, two economies running on that plateau, and there is a newer economy of narrative which extracts value from the plain fact that the physical asset is unreachable and unseen. The very remoteness that makes the ice worthless as real estate makes it priceless as a story. And both economies, the reserve and the rumour, rest on exactly the same foundation, which is that nobody actually goes there. The silence that the legend reads as a cover-up is the same silence that both the financier and the storyteller quietly depend on. An empty place is the most valuable kind of place there is, because you can sell what it might contain for as long as no one is allowed to look, and no one has any reason to. Go and look at the map yourself, not a stylized illustration, but a real chart of Antarctica, and find the Rockefeller Plateau in the western interior, and around it the Rockefeller Mountains, and the Edsel Ford Ranges, and the Executive Committee Range, that last one named for the very committee of backers who paid for the expedition, a board of directors immortalized in bedrock. Read the names off that range one after another, and you are reading a subscription list, a roll of the men who bought shares in an adventure and had their surnames transcribed onto the crust of the earth for it. There is no monument anywhere on the planet more honest than that about how a map actually gets made. The features out there were not named for saints, or for heroes, or for the fallen of some war. They were named, plainly and without apology, for the account holders, and the ice has carried the invoice ever since. Sit with the fact that these names, drawn from a handful of American fortunes of the 1920s, are the permanent official labels of the emptiest quarter of the emptiest continent. No secret was needed to put them there. They were announced in the newspapers as thanks for a check. And then ask yourself the only question that has ever mattered in this story. Not what is buried under the ice, because the answer to that is rock and old volcanoes and the flow of ancient snow. Ask instead who arranged to have their name waiting on the last blank place on earth, and why a family that understood better than anyone that ownership outlives the thing owned would want its signature on a continent that no one is allowed to sell, on a clock that has not yet run out. The plateau is not a vault, it never was. It is a receipt, printed in ice and lettering, for an investment whose payoff was always meant to arrive on a date still in the future. The map is the ledger. The name is the entry. The plateau is the line item, entered long ago in a steady hand, and the strange part is that it has not come due even now. And the reason no survey party trudges out to that plateau to plant a flag is the same reason Standard Oil never needed to own every barrel of oil that was ever pumped. When you control the record, when your name is the one the world has already agreed to write, you do not need to stand on the ground at all. You just need to be there, in ink, when the ice is finally worth something. Make of that what you will.